all royal families may not have like good governance going on right now, or like all people who are in politics may not particularly be the best leaders, because also governance was taught at that time.
However expensive it is to fix a mistake, the cheapest it will ever be is right now.
So my great-grandfather was the first to hand over his kingdom to a democratic India. Keep talking about it at home, that did he really consult anyone before doing this, or did he just like...
Since you're not just walking around with your tiara.
I'm not. I wish I was, but I'm not. You can't have 5 different hotels in a city and have them financially lucrative, which you do in Rajasthan. But you can't have that model in Gujarat because it is a dry state. So, like the little activist in me was ignited, and I was like, okay, we have to do something about this monument. Funny how a lot of the repatriation in India has happened during the Modi government. Yeah.
But how did we let these places get to that point? Who messed up? Welcome everyone to today's episode of The Overcorrection. We have a really exciting discussion with someone who I look up to a great amount. She does a tremendous amount of work on heritage restoration, preservation of culture, city planning, if I can even include that. She is a princess from the erstwhile princely state of Bhavnagar. So it's a very dear friend of mine, Brijeshwari. Thank you so much for being on The Overcorrection, or willing to be on it.
Thank you. That was a very heavy introduction.
We'll let you also maybe introduce yourself.
Yeah.
I would not introduce myself
Maybe not the city planning part, but...
yeah, maybe not even the princess part. I would just say I work with heritage restoration and conservation. That's about it. But
I can't not say that.
it's fine.
No, but it is very cool. And I think a lot of my questions are also... before we get to the art and heritage, is about like royalty in India. It's like such a storied tradition for our country that like, what does a modern age princess's life look like? Like, it probably doesn't register till a certain age, I would imagine.
No, not really. I mean, I think growing up, firstly, I grew up in Bombay, so it was pretty normal. But when we would go to Bhavnagar, which is in Gujarat, for those of you who don't know, so when we would go to Bhavnagar, it was mainly during like Diwali holidays, summer vacations and stuff. And at that point, you just see the expanse of space in comparison to, Bombay. And it's just exciting that, you as a child, you have space to run around. But yeah, I mean, slowly that kind of like grows into something more serious and something more, I guess, like you have more responsibility then. So
at a young age, did your parents maybe like sit you down as you grew up and kind of explain this responsibility to you?
No, not really, actually. It was more that you really heard these stories from like your grandparents and your sort of like other extended family, more or less the elders, like the generation above the parents. And those were just stories about like, forefathers or someone doing something great, and you just sort of feel proud about it. Like, how any lay person in today's day and age also, you hear something about your ancestors doing something great and you feel proud. So I think at the end of it, it was just hearing those stories and feeling connected to the space and the area, even though I never really lived there. So yeah.
From early on, how did you see the erstwhile princely states, their role in modern day democratic India? How was that kind of dynamic taught to you, or how do you engage with it?
So I think more or less, you sort of, you grow up as a regular person, because we do live in a democracy. It's not like there's something like great and stuff. I have to keep telling this to people because they think that, I like roam around Bhavnagar with like a crown on my head or something. Like, it really doesn't work like that. Puru has been to Bhavnagar, and trust me, it's not like that. But I think, I don't think it was like ever like you don't really sit down and like really talk about it as such or make it a big thing, because I think hopefully my parents were sort of looking at us, my brother and I, growing up as like normal human beings and not being like these arrogant creatures thinking we're like prince and princesses in democratic India. But more than that, I think what happens is you're told about, like I said, all these stories, and you're narrated these incidents. And when you look around the city also, you see public buildings now, which were at that time built by your forefathers. So you feel a sense of duty and responsibility. So that kind of somewhere just trickles in, and it's that exposure more than like the nature part of it, it's the nurturing part of it. You're just like, you're exposed to that and you just feel a sense of duty. You feel like, okay, you know, my ancestors did such great things.
Yeah.
Even though we live in a democracy, somewhere I hope I can like build on that. So you feel a sense of service. And I think that's also why you see so many royal families then join politics or, you know, end up become social entrepreneurs, have their own. It's always about like doing public welfare or doing something for society as a whole. So that duty, responsibility, I think trickles from there. It's a different thing that, you know, all royal families may not have like good governance going on right now, or like all people who are in politics may not particularly be the best leaders, because also governance was taught at that time. Today no one really teaches it, so that goes into a different, I guess, framework. But
Definitely something we should discuss. So before we get to what is happening today, I think one interesting fact about the princely state that you are from was that it was one of the first to join the modern day
India.
Union of India.
Yeah, so my great-grandfather was the first to hand over his kingdom to a democratic India and sign the annexation. And then he went on to becoming the first governor of Madras at the time, now Chennai. So yeah, it's actually very interesting because I think that one act of his to, you know, sort of have that, I guess, take that first step, because he saw what was going on. I don't think he felt like, I don't think there was something that great that he just wanted to give his kingdom.
Right.
But I think he saw the scenario around and he understood the the climate that he was sort of like engaging with. And it felt sort of like the natural move to take that first step. So
Was there a lot of opposition to him taking it?
no, I don't think so. And I also feel like he was a leader in that sense, because he didn't really, we keep talking about it at home, that did he really consult anyone before doing this? Or did he just like give a call and be like, hey, here, take my kingdom?
Yeah.
So I think he sort of like knew his own, he was a headstrong person and he did always put his people and his community first. And I think we still continue to like sort of live in that glory of his, because we as a family today have a lot of respect because of that one act of his.
Right.
So again, that goes into the, you know, like having that sense of responsibility then, because you feel like, you know, you had forefathers who were like, you know, giving your kingdom away, and then here I am like sitting and fighting over like, give my pen back after you use it to sign somewhere, something.
Yeah.
Maybe I should start rethinking why I'm being so petty, but yeah.
I wanted to ask you something, maybe even going back a bit, especially for our viewers. You said that, you know, you've been based in Bhavnagar.
Yeah.
Can you just give an idea of some of the kind of things that you do professionally there, in, you know,
Professionally?
working with that city and as both?
Since you're not just walking around with your tiara.
I'm not.
What
I
is-
wish I was, but I'm not.
What is a day in the life like?
Yeah. What are
So-
some of the things you're working on?
For me, like that exposure, the family exposure kind of led to a very natural career choice. So I ended up studying archaeology, art history as my bachelor's, and then I went on to doing my master's in heritage conservation. And I'm now pursuing a PhD in the same. So in terms of heritage and conservation, Bhavnagar has a lot. And when I actually moved back, I started to realize, because I hadn't really explored the city with that lens as a professional in that subject, it was just, like family history. So when I actually moved back, I had to first figure out what did I want to do living in Bhavnagar, because in terms of like culture, heritage, these subjects, there's not a lot of scope. So it's not like I can like go and like join like a museum, like where am I finding the museum firstly, right? So I just felt that, you know, let's start with actually like just exploring the city, understanding, like going into town planning, understanding the kind of heritage structures that are there, looking at the infrastructure, how is that changed in modern day India, and really seeing where I can add value or create an impact. So that's how my entire journey in living in Bhavnagar started. And presently I'm looking at, I'm restoring some of the monuments in the city. I am also leading the Intact chapter. So that's the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage. It's the oldest not-for-profit organization, national organization that looks at heritage preservation. And with that, again, you know, we're restoring certain structures, museums, old dilapidated spaces, and really figuring out how to, sensitize the community itself towards them, but also make them tourist-friendly places and really create that income and revenue generation, job employment for the people there through the art and culture space. So yeah, it's a bit of...
That's a lot of amazing work.
Actually, you brought it up. I was going to ask, how do you go about taking an old, dilapidated structure and start generating revenue?
Firstly, it's interesting that you asked this question because as royal families, if you look at it historically, ever since the 1970s maybe or the 1960s, most royal families converted their palaces into hotels. And that's what you see in Rajasthan is like known for that, right?
It basically joined becoming hoteliers to some extent.
Yeah, it was the sort of natural way of creating that income and revenue because these palaces were built for opulent homes. So you had people living in them. Now you have you can't afford to have 3 and 4 people living in homes which are supposed to have 100 people. It's just not, it's not possible. I mean, it'll be like a householder's biggest nightmare, I think.
I mean, we do have a house like that in Bombay, and we have always complimented their taste in
oh well. Yeah, see, now we all can't aspire to be that.
True.
I think the sort of natural progression was to have heritage hotels, and while that worked and works in Rajasthan, it doesn't specifically work everywhere else. So in Gujarat, if you actually look at, you have to study the demographic, you have to study the cultural landscape of the place, and we do have our old palace is a hotel, and it does great. It's one of the oldest heritage hotels in Gujarat. It works well. But you can't have 5 different hotels in a city and have them financially lucrative, which you do in Rajasthan. But you can't have that model in Gujarat because it is a dry state. So the money that you're sort of bringing in with weddings, especially with alcohol consumption, you're not getting that kind of revenue. So you have to then look at, your businesses, your sort of conferences, other sort of avenues, and how many of those are you going to have in a year, right? Especially in Bhavnagar. So for me, I think with each structure, we've really tried to understand, one, what was it built for, what purpose it served. Because if it served the purpose of a library, making it a hotel, you actually have to bring in bathrooms, you have to bring, there is so much infrastructure that you have to build then. So again, you're pumping in more money. So I think to really understand the space first, what it was built for, and then really seeing how you can make it lucrative present day, what is the need of the city. So those sort of things come in. Bhavnagar, that way, if you see historically, a lot of the heritage structures were built to serve some purpose. So you have hospitals, education institutes. So one tries to just utilize it for the same purpose, but upgrading it. So you have a hospital with better sort of facilities. So, I mean, anyways, we know how lucrative healthcare is in this country.
Is that one of, are these real examples you're dealing with right now in Bhavnagar? Hospital?
Education institutes is one of the examples. Yeah, it is. And the more I try to understand it, the more I realize how lucrative the education is in our country.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
it's also become the standardized way of for people to convert their money, right? So you have a lot of
that's what I've heard.
Driving into Bhavnagar once, and I saw this school coming up in the middle of nowhere. There's barren land everywhere around, some agricultural spaces. I'm like, who the hell is going to come here and study? Yeah. But then I was sort of told, and I kind of educated myself.
Maybe a bit more controversial question, because I was lucky enough to come and visit you in Bhavnagar, and you took me to the library that you were restoring.
Yeah.
Now, when I went there, it was completely dilapidated.
Yeah.
Right? And I imagine this is the case in a lot of states across the country.
Yeah.
But how did we let these places get to that point? Who messed up?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends. If you look at a lot of structures now come under the Archaeological Survey of India. Okay. So that is one aspect. The other is that a lot of heritage structures, such as a library, if privately owned, are with a trust.
Okay.
So as a trust, you are not generating that kind of revenue to maintain a structure when it's dilapidated to that extent. So if you don't have somebody regularly maintaining it, every few years when that structure needs to be painted, when you need to digitize your books at the right time, or you need to really like clean up the library. That's not happening. So that build up is sort of taking place. And then eventually it just becomes this like massive restoration venture and project, which you're then looking at CSR.
Was there never enough money to do it, or has there been corruption? Has there been misappropriation of funds that have?
I mean,
led to this?
certain trusts, yeah, for sure. I do think that there has been misappropriation of funds, or in a lot of cases, people think that, you know, oh, we can like let this work be for another 2 years and utilize those funds for other
This
things.
it's just so funny. We're talking about archaeology, but people do this with like their health and fitness in exactly the same way. One thing I've heard, which always has now stuck with me, is however expensive it is to fix a mistake, the cheapest it will ever be is right now.
Absolutely.
And people don't appreciate that. And now it's like some of these structures may have reached to a point of no return where the investment required to fix them could outweigh any possible benefit.
Exactly. I mean, you actually see that in this. Recently, I read and I actually covered it in an article I wrote. Was you have this group of monuments at Hampi in Karnataka, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's with the Archaeological Survey of India, and they've been planning the restoration of the main temple there since many years. And since the past 2-3 years, I think they had phased it out. But it was the need of the hour like 5 or 7 years back. And
maybe
today,
even possible then, financially.
Exactly. And today, just last week or the week prior, you had one of the structures completely collapse. And they were like, oh, but you know, we are restoring it. I was like, but now it really doesn't matter, because when you were supposed to act on it, you really didn't. So
And now it's going to cost 10 times as much.
exactly.
You're never going to be able to do it.
Exactly. So you're stuck in that little rut.
So when you're then working and restoring building or
Right.
doing projects like
Yeah.
these, who are the different stakeholders? Is ASI always involved? Is Intac always involved? Like, how do you get things done? How do you move through the system?
So I'll get to it with a really funny story.
Yeah,
if I may.
please.
So we have this one gentleman in Bhavnagar who sends these good morning Bhavnagar messages, you know, like WhatsApp forwards every morning.
WhatsApp University's
WhatsApp.
morning
But the
mail.
good part about his messages is that he always sends a picture of some part of the city with like a little message, you know, so somewhere you get educated on your own town and your own region as well. So he sent a picture of this monument, which is in the heart of Bhavnagar, and you had all this vegetation growing. And, you know, he sort of writes the message saying that who's responsible for this monument? And obviously I started, you know, like the little activist in me was ignited, and I was like, okay, you know, we have to do something about this monument. And it's COVID times. People are, you know, in their homes frustrated. So I was like, you know, this is the time we need to act on this frustration.
Yeah.
So let's call up all the journalists and press people of Bhavnagar, all the Gujarati media, and circulate this picture. So they start sending all these press articles. Who's responsible for this monument? Nobody knows till then. So, so then, you know, somebody calls me up and is like, oh, this is a state protected monument. It's with the Archaeological Survey. So I was like, oh, okay. So then I have a contact of an ASI person. I like sent them a very angry email being like, who's responsible for this monument? And they were like, oh, you know, it's actually it's a state protected monument. It's not of national importance. So it's with your local corporation, like your municipal corporation. So then I sent another angry email to the municipal corporation being like, you know, you are responsible for this. I get an angry response back saying, we are not responsible for this. Okay. So I was like, okay, fine. And then we write to certain other groups like local authorities, organizations. My brother and I are really on this task being like, who owns it? Yeah. So then we kind of get to it where the monument, so the marble part of it is owned by the ASI, by the State Archaeological Department, but its maintenance is with the corporation. Now the corporation does not know that the maintenance is with them because they are told that it's owned by the ASI. Now the lawns around the monument are maintained by somebody else, completely different.
What?
So then we kind of figure out that, okay, like how are we supposed to like get any permission to really restore this monument? Then we spoke to a few people locally, tried to bring in Intac in it, you know, like looked at the Intac Delhi headquarters and asked them, what do we do about it? And they were like, you know, at the end of the day, the archaeological department has to either give you permission to do something at the monument, or they need to come and do it themselves.
Yeah.
So then we wrote to the ASI. Now there are 302 monuments of national importance in Gujarat. Out of these monuments, you have different sort of departments and different offices in Gujarat. So we wrote to Rajkot and Baroda, which would have been like our closest options and circles. And they said that, it's great. We really do need to look after this monument, but we only have 3 people in our office. So then I was like, but you have 300 monuments, so you can't really work with 3 people. We're like, but we don't have funds for more people. And then when you actually look at the budget, there are funds. So it just makes you think that, is it just not distributed evenly? Or is it like, say, the top 10 national protected monuments of the country that really are being protected? And it's not feasible for one body to actually look after so many monuments.
Correct.
With this sort of infrastructure, because they are functioning on the same infrastructure as when the ASI was built in 1861, like formed.
Yeah.
And at that point, it was formed by this British gentleman who sort of created it to survey India. So it wasn't to sit and protect every single monument. You had the Orientalists who were creating this landscape view of the East and, taking their photographs and their paintings prior to photography, their artworks, to the UK, to other places. And that was the sort of image of India that was being circulated, land of snake charmers and, green, all of that jazz. It came from the Oriental view of India. And then you had the ASI who were doing these searches to see where to dig and where to excavate to understand ancient India.
Right.
So you did not have this body to be restoring monuments, to be protecting monuments, to be creating new museums, to improve tourism and experiences.
And I think it says that in the name.
Yeah.
It should just be a surveying body, but no, they are the custodians of it and they have the budget for a survey.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it was the 369th report of the ASI last year or the year before, where the report made a sort of suggestion that the ASI should be divided into 2. So you have one which does the research and, the archaeological work and the investigation and the surveying. And then you have the other one that looks at all these different conservation, museums, improving visitor experiences, those sort of things. But so far that's not happened. So I don't know. I'm not very hopeful.
Yeah, I think we need a real shake-up on that front.
Yeah,
it's like they don't
absolutely.
even know who's in charge of the monument and everybody's
Exactly.
basically pointing fingers saying, no,
Fingers,
you're
yeah.
in charge, you're in charge, you're in charge. And
Yeah,
then
so
nothing gets done.
Yeah, so you're sort of like stuck in like this loop with no real sort of impact or outcome out of it. So yeah, when you speak of stakeholders, I think the main stakeholder in a lot of these monuments is the ASI, but there is a certain amount of local sensitization and responsibility that I think as a race or as a community in India, we somewhere fail to do. Like, you have monuments which are vandalized with, you'll go to some Mehroli Bagh in Delhi also, and you'll see like hearts and so loves so and so in chalk.
Tommy loves the or some shit
Written on like
that.
a monument which is like 5,000 or 500 years old, and I'm like, what were they thinking? Did they not find a better way to profess their love for each other, or
Yeah.
was this the only solution? So I think it's a lot about education, and that was my first sort of agenda when I moved to Bhavnagar, was to just sensitize people and document the historic structures. When you have a race or a population that doesn't know anything or it does not know enough, then obviously they're not going to be protecting those spaces or respecting those spaces.
But I think it's also top down. Like, if these were not abandoned, dilapidated structures, people would intrinsically, like, you've seen how when you're in a place that's dirty, it's so much easier to litter versus when you're in you go to London or something, it's like, no, I'll walk like 200 meters to find a dustbin for this little Twix wrapper or something like
Yeah.
that. So I think like the vandalism stems from what they see as a top-down lack of care for these.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that I feel like it's always like you see, I was reading about this when the state elections were happening, when the general elections were happening, and you had Indore. I don't know if any of you
They keep winning
saw
like the Clean City
the
Award,
Clean
right?
City, but the MLA, the Member of Parliament from there actually won with a great majority. And second to him was Nota. and I thought that was I thought that spoke a lot about how happy the people of that city are with the infrastructure that's created or with the kind of impact that's being done. So now if you have, you know, a little hymn or whatever, the sound that plays in Indore every day, I'm told at 5:30 or 6 in the morning, the cleaning truck goes and this like Swachhta song plays. Now if you're going to be sort of drilling that into citizens' ears every morning, they're going to be frustrated that why do I have to listen to this song every morning? But then they're also like, it's going to like probably like sort of go in their heads every time they think of like throwing a rapper somewhere. So I think that sensitization in heritage structures is very essential. I also feel like somewhere we need to learn to respect our historic properties rather than just learn how to sell them.
Yeah, very good point.
So you can't just like be selling your artisans like, oh, come and see like our rural India and everybody doing great embroidery work here. Like if you respect them enough, like if there's like, you know, if they're making enough, then you don't have to say this is a dying craft from here and sell it like.
Yeah, like I was going to ask because like it should not be charity. Like we cannot keep looking at promoting handicrafts because I'm trying to do some good. Like I'm not going to buy... Like if I buy a handicrafts bag just because some underprivileged person has made it and I'm never going to use it, I'm not really doing justice to their art or in any real way respecting it at all.
Yeah, so there's also that dignity of labor that kind of goes out the window then, right? So then the next generation's like, oh, my parents earned like, you know, a measly amount doing this. There's no respect in it. There's no like job satisfaction. There's no real income being earned, financial security. So why should I bother doing it?
So I wanted to ask your take on modern abstract art.
Okay.
Because I have always had a problem with it. I accept that I know nothing about art. But I don't think art is made to be enjoyed by people who know about it. Like, I don't think you need to be a musician to appreciate a song.
I don't think anyone knows anything about art. I'm just going to, like, interrupt you with that.
Then maybe you'll disagree because I think this idea of abstract art where anything can be art, I learned it started as a movement to launder money. So it's essentially a way of, I can say, make a piece of shit painting with just random blobs that a 5-year-old could do by mistake. And anonymously buy it myself through a few connections and now it's legitimate income.
Right.
This is a movement that has been like created to launder drug money.
Right.
And I will certainly like put some, like I'll show you some references for this. I know it sounds crazy. But it made the most sense. It made more sense than 10 people staring at this square and like a circle like written around it and say, imagine your future in this space between the circle and the square, and now it's art.
See, I'll say one thing about that. For me, I've looked at, you know, art owned by my family, and there's always, you know, you come from sort of a family where there was a lot of patronage in the arts.
Right.
So you had a lot of these, you know, great artists who use a lot of skill, and you know, there was a lot of thought that went into that piece of work, and that's translated into the painting itself. And some of those works are works that, you know, you can like look at for hours and days and years and not get tired of seeing them. And then obviously you come to modern art, which has been a movement globally, not just in India. Now, where laundering money is concerned, it may have started because of that, but I think today it works very well with the kind of sort of world we're living in, because you are in this space where everything is supposed to be introspected on what the individual is feeling and thinking and sensing, and it's a lot about the self. While historically, when you look at art, if you look at even like, you know, your greats of Europe and you look at a Michelangelo's work, or you look at a Raja Ravi Verma in India, the work was done for somebody. It was patronage. So for example, you have a portrait of a Maharaja, or you have a sort of landscape view of a palace or a darbar seated, or you know, you have a lot of biblical artwork. So it's a lot about religion or what the church followed. So you see the Vatican. So there's a lot of, it's about something else. You're not painting what you are feeling, but you're using your feelings as a form of creativity. So you're doing your colors, you're going into the colors, you're going into the depth of light. Your techniques are being explored in terms of what you are feeling emotionally. But here you are just making two strokes of from a brush, and you're calling that your feeling. So there is one technique lacking in your art in terms of if you look at it from like a textbook way of
So I think
painting.
all art has there are when you said no one knows about art in a subjective way, I can agree. But in a point of view that someone who knows the basic techniques of texturizing or whatever you need to know in art, they certainly know more about art than.
Absolutely. But see, what's happened now is that it's become a lot about what I'm feeling and how I'm so sensitive that you will call my two strokes with the brush insignificant, right? So then I'll end up having all sorts of other health issues because you've created.
That's a really good point.
So
It's
there's
like a
a lot
reflection of the times.
It's a reflection of the times. So
I think it's directly at odds with any chance we have of reclaiming traditional art, because I feel they are exactly counter to each other, the approach to art. So I feel the more this modern, excessively subjective art flows in, and the breaking of all rules, and that's like how jazz music is like infiltrating like music. Like it started as a way to like break rules and with some movement, and then it's just deteriorated into.
But every art movement has always been a direct reflection of the society. So, for example, if you look at the Bengal School of Art, which culminated as a way of debunking British ways of teaching art. And you have your Swadeshi movement along with that.
Right.
So again, that's talking about nationalism, nation building, national pride, all those aspects. So you're going into like what society needed at the hour, what artists were inspired from in terms of like societal change. So then you have artists drawing a Bharat Maas painting because that's what they felt like was the need of the hour. And today the need of the hour has become what I am feeling. So then my art is a direct translation of that, because I am feeling sad. So I'm going to do a black work and just have one dot on it, because that little light is the little hope I have in my life.
Do you feel that has reached India?
Yeah,
Or
absolutely.
is this like more still in the West?
No, it's everywhere. I think it's a global phenomena. There are obviously very good artists and very talented artists even today, but that's besides the point. Like you do have this movement that's happening, and it's a lot about serving yourself rather than looking at the community as a whole or the sort of humanity as a whole. So I think a lot of it kind of stems from how we look at art and how we appreciate art, and how that is also changing, because we're starting to use art as a way of understanding the artist rather than appreciating the technique or the setting of the artwork.
I do think you're onto something pretty
yeah,
profound in that
that's
sense.
actually-
It's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
from being super individualistic or going towards becoming
Yeah.
more and more individualistic, which is
Exactly.
it's me, this is my story,
Yeah.
this is my,
Yeah.
And it wouldn't. And the question is the free market responding to it, or are artists all broke now?
No. I mean, Indian art is actually, in terms of like monetarily and financially, it's at a very good high point, I would say, especially with modern and contemporary art. There is a lot of selling, lot of buying. You have another new medium, which is
Money
the
laundering, I told you.
there's a lot of digital and NFTs and all those other things that are coming into the market, which is a completely a different
word, no?
world altogether.
Speaking of like West and India, since we brought it up, I wanted to know what are your thoughts on a lot of this movement on stolen artifacts and repatriating stolen artifacts. I just saw Oxford agreed to return something almost after 100 years or something.
500-year-old bronze work actually from Tamil Nadu.
Wow.
So yeah, it's interesting. I think again this is like a global thing. Like countries are suddenly realizing that we should. It's become a more of a ethical and a more sort of way of kind of building relationships between countries. It's funny how a lot of the repatriation in India has happened during the Modi government. I don't know if it's related directly related to like, you know, political ties being strengthened or,
Yeah.
you know, because he's managed to really travel to every country and
Yeah.
chit chat with every
Yeah, head of
leader.
state, yeah, doesn't go down
So
far.
yeah, so maybe it's got something to do with that. It may also have something to do with the fact that a lot of other countries are in the process of, you know, museums. You have the Met in the US also, that's, you know, handing over bronze objects and idols because it's like, oh, it's the right thing to do, and it's a lot about the ethical nuances around it. So yeah, I mean, I feel personally that firstly, when it comes to antiques, because I think about a year or so ago, I read this article which was like, you know, give us back the Kohinoor or something from
Yeah.
like Britain. And it just made me think that, yeah, I'm all for repatriation of stolen artifacts. Firstly, a lot of artifacts were stolen because of our sort of lack of know-how.
That's what I'm saying. It was
So it was you know, you had emergency in India. A lot of families who owned these artifacts did not know how to store them, how to house them. A lot of other places like temples, which had a lot of idols and bronze works and, you know, these statues, were afraid that someone would take them or steal them. So then they were also sending them, you know, shipping them across. And then you had this antiquity law of 1972, which the 19th section of that says that if you the government can seize any antique at any point in time and make it a public
like a public
artifact.
good, I guess. Okay.
Yeah, if they feel the need to do so.
Whoa.
So I mean, if you look at it today, it's a very draconian law, but people were scared that, you know, I declare my antique, I register my antique, it may go. So then either you hide it in your house and you don't register it, which you're supposed to legally, or you ship it somewhere and like sell it and get it smuggled.
And the government's not even buying it from you. They're just going to take it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's that, I think it's the fear and that stigma that really led to these artifacts really
What
being
year did that
smuggled.
happen? Sorry.
So 1972. Yeah, so 72, just after emergency,
After
right? So there's
emergency,
a lot of turmoil in this country. Like you have royal families who don't know how to look after their assets. You have custodians of temples and other religious institutes who don't know how they're going to, you know, move forward or how they're going to carry on. How will they sort of like fund their institutes also? So that's when you have this like illicit trade and smuggling of antiques going on. And now to really trace all those, which antique was smuggled is very difficult. You have like, of course, if you have a Met and you have an Ashmolean and a British Museum, it's easy that, British Museum houses so many stolen artifacts. But you have to look back at the history of them and then see if it's of religious importance, if it's of cultural importance. Then I understand the repatriation of it, because it means something to that society or that culture more than it would possibly mean for that museum or institution.
It essentially has to not be about the financial value of it.
It shouldn't. It should
Otherwise,
be. It
just
should be about the
bin-
cultural value
Yes.
of it. Yeah.
Or either ways, I still think
Yeah.
you're onto something. I think
Yeah.
when I read about it, sometimes, I mean, the maybe patriotic string in my heart is like, good, like, give us back
Yeah.
the Kohinoor. But part of it is like,
Yeah.
it's a bit of an overcorrection to say that give everything back that was
Exactly.
stolen, because sometimes it would have been like given.
Yeah.
There's more story to each artifact, right?
So the ASI actually started a started doing this database, and I think they've recorded about 15 lakh or 16 lakh antiques, and it's digitally like recorded and stuff. And they were sort of, they got a lot of slack for it because they were like, in like so many years, you've only managed to record so many artifacts which are housed in this country.
Yeah.
So what about the ones from outside? How are you going to record those?
Correct.
Then you're going to ask for them back. Like, let's just start with what's here first. Like,
Correct.
restore them, look after it, make it accessible for people to see those antiquities and those, artifacts. Then let's get to the other stuff.
Correct.
So
Fix the marble monument in Babylon first.
Exactly,
instead of
exactly
trying to
my
bring back the
point.
Kohinoor. But like, that's a joke, right? If you
Yeah.
ask the British Museum to like repatriate, their museum will be empty.
Yeah. Yeah.
They took everything.
Or at least then there should be some sort of commission on entries into the British Royal Museum.
The colonies get to go for free.
Yeah.
But that's something I don't get. I mean, this is kind of related to art or like repatriation or reclaiming old culture, and especially since we talk a lot about decolonization and things like that, which I do truly believe in. But at some level, there's this movement of like tearing down statues. I think it happened in like in the UK as well.
Yeah.
In a few, if it was like a slaver or
Yeah.
someone that had a particularly,
or a dark past.
yeah. But I'm like, go back in time, which one of these guys would have been clean? Tomorrow you start tearing down statues in India, you'll like.
But more than statues, frankly, in India, my problem is with changing names of cities
Yeah.
and roads. I
don't get it.
I just don't get it. I don't get it for the simple reason that it's actually really expensive to do that.
Oh, really?
So yeah, imagine.
Oh, yeah, I
I mean,
guess
you
there's a
have
knock-on cost and everything.
You have a Victoria terminus. It's changed to Chhatrapati terminus.
Yeah.
Then they feel bad that you've not added Maharaj to it, so the name is
Chhatrapati
again
Maharaj.
the name is again changed.
Yeah.
So in all those name changes, you're changing like obviously your ticketing, your routes, your different billboards, your advertisement, all of that. And obviously we live in India. There's a lot of paperwork. So all of that.
You got to do it creatively how the BMC did it. I think BMC was actually Bombay Municipal Corporation.
No, it's Brihan Mumbai Mahanagar Palika. Right?
Wasn't it before? Like it was Bombay
really? I
Municipal.
wasn't aware of this.
I think because I asked someone, I was like, I saw the full form of
Yeah.
Brihan Mumbai Mahanagar. I was like, that's not what they would call it if that was the.
That
they
is
would have
true,
called it.
actually.
They
I
would
never
have
thought
called
of
it
that.
Mumbai Municipal Corporation if that was the
But
original
see,
name.
then the BMC is like a rich body, so they can afford to
They
keep
could
changing
have,
the
and they
name.
didn't. They were like, no, we need to keep our branding the same.
So we'll call it Brihan
okay.
Mumbai.
Brihan
Mumbai
Mumbai.
instead of otherwise it would have been Mumbai Municipal Corporation.
Oh yeah.
I didn't
actually.
think about
Yeah.
that.
But I asked someone, I was like, why would they name it Brihan Mumbai? It's
Yeah, I
like
didn't-
such a weird name to name it.
Yeah, it is a. It doesn't.
And I was like,
it
is it
doesn't
just
add
because
up.
they had a solid brand with BMC and they couldn't let that go? And I think that's actually what happened.
Yeah, but I mean, I wouldn't be surprised because you also have this happening with like cities now. For example, I remember they wanted to change the name of Ahmedabad to Karnavati or something like that.
Yeah.
And it became a cultural issue then because Ahmedabad is a UNESCO heritage city. And it's one of the main reasons why it's got its tag is because it was sort of formed, the city was formed by the ruler Ahmad Shah. So that's why it's called Ahmedabad.
Yeah.
Now, if you remove that name, which is one of the main reasons why it's a UNESCO, like it's got that UNESCO tag, it may not, they may not like sort of, they may delist it and all of that.
Yeah.
So we still have Ahmedabad. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So then to kind of bring it all together, right? We've spoken about, repatriation of stolen artifacts. We've spoken about the role that people that are from princely states
yeah.
now play in today's democracy. I wanted to get your thoughts on how do you see the future of now, whether it's heritage restoration, arts, traditional artifacts, traditional handicrafts. Where are we going with this? And how can India kind of cement its place as a leader in harnessing its potential? Because we clearly have it.
And what is the non-charity feeling route to it? 'Cause right now-
Non-charity, it's
yeah.
interesting you say that because I was just trying to explain this non-charity. We had an embroidery workshop in Bhavnagar just happening last week, I think. And, a lot of it was about sort of improving the skill and the technique. So people who already know how to like work on a certain embroidery technique, how can they improve or like, neaten their work or make it better? And one of the artisans actually asked me, she's like, what is the point of us like doing it neater? Like, are we going to get paid more?
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, that is their main
It's an income
sort of,
driver, right?
yeah, it is their main objective unless you're just like, sort of bored at home and like embroidering or something. So I was like, you have a country like say Italy where, you have people who are proud of that Italian leather and craftsmanship. We don't have our artisans that way proud of the work that they're creating in terms of financial value. They're happy that, I created this, very nice. But they are not the type who will say, this is not worth 100 rupees, this is worth $1,000. And if you don't give me those 1,000 rupees, I'm not going to sell it to you. When we get to that point of being that proud or having artisans who are that proud of the work that they're creating, the craftsmanship, that's when we'll really go from that charity factor or that, craft is a poor person thing to really like, making it something more exquisite, more luxurious.
Today's perception of what is appealing about Indian handicrafts is, look how poor the person who made this is. Like, that is the USP to buy things. So
See, you also have sort of luxury brands, like you had a Dior come in here. You have the
like Sabyasachi came in
Chanakya
and-
School of Art in Bombay. All their artisans are the ones who are supplying the dresses to Dior then. But
Wow.
are they making the same kind of income, right? So when you're looking at the sort of finances of it, it doesn't add up because we're still seen as, that made in China, made in India. Like, we've not reached that point where it's like, oh, this must be a really good product, or it must have been woven or embroidered really nicely because it's made in India.
So same with, I guess, fashion as it is in tech. We are looked at as cheap manufacturing rather than creativity.
Exactly.
It's a shame because
Yeah.
the craftsmanship is like world class, right?
Craftsmanship is world class.
If it is.
We were, I recently, a few months ago, I visited Agra and we were talking to these artisans who do the Makrana marble work. And, this guy's like making these exquisite inlay work on the marble, and he's telling me how it takes him 1 month to finish that little detailing. And thankfully, he gets a lot of support in terms of government subsidies and stuff to import and export and all these aspects. But he's like, the same kind of work that we are doing here is not being done anywhere in the world. But we can't just say we demand X amount and we'll get it, because they're like, but it's being done in India, it's cheap labor. It can't be like, you can't be spending, how can you be spending $3,000 on it? It should be just $300.
So here you have like a deflated market, when on the other side you have such a like Louis Vuitton bags, where they could make 1 million of these bags, but they have to control supply to mark something up 10,000 like X. And here we have people who are like, I have to work a month for this, but people are paying it like I'm factory printing it out.
Exactly. So I see a lot of these, like, I don't know if it comes up in your Instagram as well, but on mine, I see a lot of these reels people are making of like an artisan really doing this exquisite embroidery, or somebody traveling to like a old part of Delhi and really looking at the people there, or how they're making some, something historic in terms of the craftsmanship and the skill. And then the same person, will like do some sort of a recording where they're like, oh, but this is a dying craft, no one is buying it. And I'm like, but we're not selling it properly then, right?
Yeah.
We are not building up on that properly. So till we don't get to it, it will be a dying.
I mean, if Louis Vuitton can sell you a bag that can't hold your phone and literally can't fit a cell phone into, and they can figure out how to sell something that useless, then I'm sure it's a selling issue, because a bag is a bag at the end of the day. It's marketing, it's vibes. And so that means it's totally possible. It's not that we are lacking in anything.
No, we're not lacking. But see, when you talk about marketing, now if you create a product and you have 100% confidence in that product, like you see those people on Shark Tank coming in, like, they know that they have the trust of their product, on their product. And you need the artisan to have that kind of trust and faith on their product.
Yeah, right.
So when you have that, then you're going to be like, I'm not going to sell it to you for so and so amount, because my product is worth a lot more.
I think that's the thing at some level, dude. It's like a confidence in yourself.
Exactly.
And like, because I think, being, a post-colonized country, I think I still see that confidence is lacking in our own people,
so
right?
I do think that this is something that the BJP and the Modi government actually has done very well, is that they have really gone into the whole nation pride and nation building. And I think somewhere between like post-independence till maybe the early 2000s, we kind of forgot about that. So you had a lot of people who were always looking at the West as the brighter future and the better land. And there wasn't that nation pride which probably you had just post-independence, because that was the Swadeshi movement, and now you're having the same Make in India movement. So I think that there was that gap, but now we're getting back to it, and I think at the end of it, it has to be about really like, in terms of even heritage restoration or in terms of craftsmanship, it has to be a sense of pride that you have for what the country is worth and what the country offers, and I think only then all these things can really like move forward.
Yeah, and I think it's so true, because, like I'm comparing, like I'm not going to compare a local artisan to Louis Vuitton, but I can at least compare them to Zara to start. And you were telling me how you get your shirts custom made from the guy who basically just supplies to Zara.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's the same fit.
They all do the same work for Zara.
And so it's this international brand, but all the stuff you're buying is still locally made.
Yeah, so it's India, China, Bangladesh, right? Those are the three main players in terms of like all sorts of like embroidery to artisan to fabric work. The clothing industry, I think to a large extent, is based on these three players. And the moment I think we start saying that, oh no, like, Indian handlooms or Indian fabric is worth much more, I mean, we will be valued better then, I guess.
So is this where you think like a more fundamental shift has to happen?
Yeah, absolutely.
And how do you say you meet someone, and what do you say to them? Like, I mean, you explained it to us here, But when they say, am I going to make more money? Do you say like maybe in 10 years if this picks up?
See,
or-
no, but see, that's where I come back to my heritage sensitization topic, right? Because in Bhavnagar as well, I work with, through Intac, I work with schools and colleges and students. And we always talk about the fact that, yeah, you're not in your history textbooks in school, you're not taught about your city and your region. But when you are proud of your surroundings, that's when you will actually do simple things like not litter your spaces.
Correct.
Or grow up to be better, well-informed town planners and urban developers and more respectful architects and engineers, because you are seeing those monuments, you're seeing those historic institutions, and you will have a certain design framework or respect for that region and community. And similar to that in terms of like embroidery and artisans. So all the artisans who I work with in Bhavnagar, we don't like what they say they're worth, we actually give them much more than that, because we also then price those artifacts. So it's not
Yeah.
like we're like, doing some service here.
Yeah.
But we do try to keep that value higher, because it is supposed to kind of somewhere serve the community and also be a financially viable.
Yeah, and also you have the marketing know-how to price it there and get it to sell, which they are lacking. So that's,
Exactly. So
they are actually underpricing it out of, even though to someone like you where they know you would pay more,
because they don't have that confidence, they don't have that skill set, they've not been taught entrepreneurship or marketing, right? They've learned an embroidery technique from their grandmother to their mother to their own self, and they're doing that at home. That's about it. And in this region of Gujarat, which is the Saurashtra region, so you still have a lot of women who are not allowed to go out of their homes and work. So this is the only income that they can really monetize on. It's either taking tuitions at home if they have like a BA or a basic degree, or they're doing handwork, artisanal work skills that they're monetizing on. That's about it.
Yeah, I think we have a long way to go, but I think
Yeah.
but it's been positive. At least I see it
Yeah,
changing. I think
it
with
is.
people like you are doing this kind of work,
No,
that's
I-
already a sign.
I think
right?
there are a lot of very well sort of educated and interested people, but we do also have a very large population.
Correct.
So you have to counter, like you have to sort of take that in. You also have to take in the fact that this is such a diverse country.
Yeah.
What works for me in Bhavnagar may not work for somebody in South India or North India.
Yeah.
So it's, again, what works in Rajasthan may not be beneficial to somebody in the Northeast.
Yeah.
So we have so much diversity in this country, which is the beauty of it. So I think regionally you kind of have to look at these things and understand them and see what is the need of an hour there.
definitely.
So yeah.
Great.
Amazing.
Thank you. I think we can wrap it up there unless
Yeah.
you have any more questions.
No,
That
thank
was
you so
really good.
much.
That was a lot
No,
of fun.
thank
Vijayashree,
you.
for
Thank
joining.
you. It was a
Discuss some
lovely
things I did not
chat.
expect.